Hello, and welcome to my new AMD 486 DX4-100Mhz Visa Local Bus PC. And just look at this case. Remember that this is 1995-1996 era. This case has to be the most futuristic looking case from that era. And look at this opening panel. And look what happens when I turn it on. You immediately see this gorgeous speed indicator, the green 100 and the red megahertz indication. It's not like any other speed indicator that I saw from that era. In this video, I'm going to give you a walkthrough of this gorgeous case. We'll take a look at the inside and see how it is structured. Do a complete disassembly of the system and go over every individual component that is included in the machine. And see what kind of upgrades we can perform on it, as it only contained a disk drive and a hard drive basically. So let's get things started. I'm going to take the machine over to the kitchen because we need to do some cleaning. Now the PC was in reasonable condition when I got it, but it does need some cleaning. But nonetheless, this is a gorgeous case. Now moving to the back of the case, you see the usual expansion cards, you see the AT keyboard connector and power supply. But you might also be wondering, why is this case upside down? Well, in fact, it's not. This is one of those cases where everything is inverted, and the motherboard is kind of hanging upside down. They've also placed the power supply in this mini tower at the bottom. So when you look at it from the back, it actually looks like the case is put upside down, while in fact it's not. Now the case also contains a front cover that you can open by pushing this latch here, where it will expose the disk drive and nothing more. So we'll be adding a cdrom drive here. And the cool thing is that this front panel slides all the way to the side of the computer. But now it's time to take a look inside the case, so we'll be opening her up. So now it becomes a bit clearer on how the internal layout has been designed. And no, I have not turned this PC upside down. This is how it would normally sit on your desktop. So we have the power supply on the bottom, but the motherboard sits at the opposite side of the case. And when you turn it and look at the backside, it's actually like it's been turned upside down. Now I am going to be cleaning it. And luckily the front panel of this case can come off quite easily. You have these like metal clips that you can pull to get the casing to get the front bezel off of the case. So there are no screws that need to be detached, so it's a pretty easy process. So let's take it off right now. So with the front cover off, we can see the LED segments, the hard drive and disk drive. We have the power on switch, a reset button, and a turbo button, followed by a key lock. So with the front panel off, we have a couple of 5¼ inch drive bay front panels. And I really like this hinge mechanism. The fact that it can slide all the way back is really cool. Now it is pretty dirty, so it will need to get a good cleaning. So I'm going to be removing these metal clips here. It will make it a lot easier to clean the entire case. I can submerge it completely and clean it without having to worry about these things sticking out here. Now, this is not the most glamorous part of retro computing, but it is something that is really necessary. So I'm just going to be filling up some water here so that I can completely submerge the front panel and give it a good cleaning. Now I like to use a toothbrush to get into these difficult to reach places. And the scrubber to go over the flat surfaces and get everything nice and clean. As we're letting this dry, let's go back to the case where I will be dismantling everything. So we'll start by unhooking the IDE cables for the hard drive and for the floppy drive, removing the power cables so that we can remove the disk drive and hard drive from the case. Now it looks like somebody went creative with the IDE cables to do some cable management, but they will need to go. Now both the disk drive and the hard drive are held in place by this frame which is attached to the front of the case. So all we need to do is unscrew these two screws here, and the hard drive and disk drive should just come straight out. Seems we have a nice Western Digital Caviar 2420, a 425 megabyte hard drive, and the standard 1.4 megabyte disk drive, 3.5 inch. So I'm going to be removing both the hard drive and the disk drive from this frame so that I can give both a good cleaning. So I'm also going to be taking off the front cover of the 3.5 inch disk drive so that we can clean the front panel and the button as well. Now with that out of the way, I noticed that the CPU cooler fell off. So I have the impression that something broke off so that it wasn't held in place anymore. So I'll need to be taking a look at that. It's actually hooked up to the main board directly. There's a Molex connector on the main board that can power this CPU cooler. But it's pretty dirty, so I don't know if it will still work. I'm gonna see if I can clean it off a little bit and see how big of a damage there is. And otherwise I'll need to replace it. So we've got our AMD DX4-100Mhz CPU. It's an A open mainboard SIS chipset. So I'm going to start removing the expansion cards, starting with this networking card on top. Now these Visa local bus cards, due to their size and especially the size of the overall connector length, make it very difficult to get these cards in and out of these computers. At least that's what I remember from working with these computers back in the day. So this is a pretty generic WinBond UMC based controller. Next up we will have the video card, and in this case it's a Trident Visa Local Bus video card. And not having saved the best for last, we're going to conclude with this modem card, which has become totally obsolete and useless here. So all that's left now is removing these jumper cables here for the displays and the buttons and the LEDs on the case. Disconnecting the AT power supply from the main board. And remove the apparent single screw that holds the motherboard onto the case. And with all of that out of the way, we can slide out the main board out of the case. And now that we have a good view on the case, we can see how dirty it actually is. So I'm going to be taking this outside, giving it a good cleaning, removing the power supply to access everything a little better. So here we have an overview of all the components which were in the PC. Now the PC contained a modem card, something that has become totally obsolete here and cannot be used here anymore. So yeah, I'm going to get rid of this one. The computer did come with a networking card. This is an NE2000 compatible networking card from Maxtech. It's an NX16BT. It only has this BNC connector, so no UTP, which is a bit of a shame. I'm going to see if I can get it to work, but I'll probably replace it with a UTP version. Now the controller card to hook up the disk drive and the hard drive is your typical UMC WinBond chipset based controller card, Visa Local Bus. It does have some connectors that aren't populated, data security, virus protect. Not really sure what this is, we'll need to look that up. But yeah, it's a pretty standard controller card. Now the video card in this system is also a Visa Local Bus one. It's a Trident 9440 AGI video card. Dates from 1993. These cards were really popular back in the day. They were used in a lot of systems, both ISA and Visa Local Bus. They're not the fastest cards, but yeah, it'll do for this system for now. Now the hard drive is a Western Digital Caviar 2420. It's a 425 megabyte hard drive. Dates November 1994. These were really popular back in the days. 400 megabytes is about the same size for this time period. A lot of 486s, late 486s had those. It's a pretty decent hard drive. The computer also came with 8 megabytes of RAM, so we have 2 times 4 megabyte here. So let's take a closer look at the main board. And first thing we notice is that we have a coin cell battery, which is very nice, so there will be no leakage. For those of you who've watched my other 486 video, you can see how much damage such an old style battery can do on a main board. We have a standard keyboard connector, an AT style keyboard connector, which is good. We have a standard AT power connector, so no ATX power supplies. And we have 4 SIM slots so that we can attach our 2 SIM modules, 4 megabyte each, giving us a total of 8 megabytes. We have level 2 cache on the main board, 256 kilobytes, so we have 8 slots to put the level 2 cache, half of it is filled. The main board supports up to 512 kilobytes of level 2 cache. We have the BIOS chip, which is an AMD BIOS chip from 1993, American Megatrends. This is one of those graphical user interface based BIOS systems, not like your standard award BIOS. So this has these like little windows and icons that you can click in order to set the various items on the main board. So yeah, either you're in love with it or you hate it. I'm personally not a big fan, but yeah, it gets the job done, I guess. The motherboard also exposes a Molex connector here, so you have access to 5 volts and 12 volts. And we also have the pins for the various buttons and LEDs to interact with the case. We have an SIS chipset, so it supports both Intel, AMD, a wide range of processors. We have 4 standard ISA slots and 3 VISA local bus slots. And we have the main CPU, obviously, the AMD DX4-100Mhz. You can also see the voltage regulator, because this CPU works on 3 volts as opposed to the normal 5 volts that you see on most Intel-based CPUs. So let's now take a closer look at the actual CPU. So this is a 3-volt CPU using a 168-pin grid array package that is used for socket 3 motherboards. Now this is important, as the previous socket, the socket 2, which also accommodates 486 CPUs, only worked at 5 volts. So placing this kind of CPU in a 5-volt socket will effectively destroy the CPU. So on the CPU we have the AMD logo, Advanced Micro Devices. It was assembled in Malaysia. And the product name was AM486 DX4-100Mhz. So the CPU is an 8486 compatible CPU. This particular model was released in 1995 following an Intel lawsuit, where AMD had to destroy their older DX4-100 models as it contained the Intel's in-circuit emulation microcode, or ICE microcode. Now during that period, AMD had approximately 20% market share of desktop CPUs, selling roughly 5 million CPUs in 1994. It runs at a frequency of 100 MHz with a front-side bus speed of 33 MHz, thus using a clock multiplier of 3. The reason why this is not a DX3 CPU is again related to Intel legal issues. So for the manufacturing process, it uses 500 nanometer manufacturing. It has a single core and it uses about 1.2 million transistors. Now this is a 3-volt CPU, so its operating core runs at 3.3 volts and its operating temperature lies around 85 degrees Celsius. Now there's also a product code here which mentions 100NV8T. So this is an internal product code of AMD used to specify some of the characteristics. So the 100 specifies the CPU clock speed. The N specifies the fact whether or not the CPU supports the ICE code. V specifies for the fact that it's a 3-volt CPU. The 8 means that there is 8 kilobytes of level 1 cache, and the T specifies the fact that it is write-through cache. The CPU also contains a build code, so here it says 1995, and 13, which is the 13th week of that year. So that would have been end of March, beginning of April of 1995. So again, it's clearly mentioned that this is a 3-volt CPU, so it needs a motherboard that supports this type of 3.3 volt core operation. So that means a socket 3 motherboard that supports the 3 volts, or a special CPU adapter which has a voltage regulator on board to regulate the voltage from the 5 volt coming from the motherboard to the 3.3 volt that the CPU expects. AMD also advises the use of a heatsink and a fan for the CPU. And finally, we have a nice Microsoft Windows logo here on the chip, just to emphasize the fact that AMD was going for Windows compatibility and not so much focusing only on x86 compatibility. Now, this was a great CPU back in the day. It was priced relatively low, lower than the Intel DX2-66. And to some extent, it could even outpace an early Pentium 60 in fixed point calculations, although it lacked a bit in floating point calculations. And funnily enough, to some extent, it was the popularity of the MP3 music format that made it painfully clear that people needed to step up their game and move towards more Pentium-based CPUs. But all in all, a great CPU to have back in those days. Now, as you can see, the case has cleaned up pretty nicely. There are still a couple of stains that I couldn't get off immediately, but I am going to be leaving it at that. We have a 200 watt power supply that seems to be functioning very well. Here we have a good view on the speed indicator and the various LEDs for turbo button, power on and hard drive, and the 3.5 and 5.25 inch drive bays. Here you can see the jumpers that are needed to configure the speed indicator and all of the cables that go into the motherboard to control the buttons and the LEDs. So now I'm just going to be sliding in the main board into the case. It's using these white plastic standoffs to slide into the designated holes on the back of the case. There's one screw that needs to be attached. And I'm going to be adding the Trident video card just to do a quick boot up test. Again, we have the long Visa Local Bus interface, which is quite honestly a pain to add and remove cards. We also need power, so we're going to be attaching our AT power connectors coming from the power supply. Now, as opposed to ATX-based machines where you also need to have a power switch on the motherboard itself, the mechanical switch of the AT power supply will just power the board directly, so this should work as a first boot up test. But for that we need a monitor, so I'm just going to be using this old LCD monitor as a display. I'm going to be hooking up the power connector for the monitor, and insert the VGA cable into the card, and let's power her up. Now you'll notice that the display says 00 megahertz. This is because the turbo button hasn't been attached to the main board yet. So yeah, as far as the first boot goes, this is already a success. And we're going to continue with the assembly by putting back in place the front panel of the disk drive, inserting the disk drive and the hard drive back into the case, putting in our controller card, attaching our controller card bracket, hooking up our floppy drive and hard drive cables, connecting them up to our floppy drive and ID connector on the controller card, and connecting all of the LEDs and buttons coming from the case. Now with the PC all cleaned up, the lid put back on, we can start the system. In part 2, I'll go over how I installed the cdrom drive, the issues that we had with it, the issues we had with installing a sound card, the networking interface hiccups we had, and of course some fun with I/O addresses, IRQs, and DMA channels. But in part 2 we'll also look at some of my favorite games from that time period that should in theory work on this PC, but we'll see how it goes. As you all know that these system requirements are most of the time very much underestimated, and you need a more powerful PC most of the time to get the most out of it. But I hope you've enjoyed this video so far, so if you like it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more retro content, and get notified when part 2 will be coming your way. Hope to see you guys soon. Bye bye.